Hi, I have a video on my main channel wherein I go over two molecules known as zeaxanthin and lutein and their effect on our eye health. Now, during that investigation, I went over a number of studies and stumbled across one study looking for sources of lutein and zeaxanthin for our eye health. And that study was focused on egg consumption. And if consuming eggs, which do contain lutein and zeaxanthin, if that could increase our bioavailable or blood levels of lutein and zeaxanthin. So I thought I'd share that just because I don't think that that fits on the main channel. But before I get into that specifically, this is the study that I'll be going over. What I'd like to also do is actually give you a bit of a primer on lutein and zeaxanthin, because if you haven't watched the main video, then you have no idea what I'm talking about. So lutein and zeaxanthin are two molecules that are known as carotenoids. So they belong to a family of molecules. There's also a sibling molecule that's closely related to them called meso-zeaxanthin. And these two molecules are known for having an effect on our eye health, at least based off of my investigation, and the mechanisms of which are pretty abundant. But the main mechanism is that they find themselves in two particular areas, or two main areas of the eye. So you can see here that there are a number of different sections of the eye. You're probably familiar. You've probably heard of the cornea, the pupil, and all that stuff. However, we're focused on the retina, so the back section of the eyeball. And if we focus in on a particular concentrated area here called the fovea and the macula, if we were to zoom into the cells that make up that area, you'd find that it has high levels of zeaxanthin and lutein, but specifically zeaxanthin. And that's what makes zeaxanthin and lutein such unique molecules for eye health, because they specifically target to our eyes. Now, lutein is also found in other tissues, and zeaxanthin may be as well, but zeaxanthin has an especially strong affinity for this exact region of the eye. So lutein is found throughout the retina, but zeaxanthin is found more specifically in that one region. So what happens once they enter that region? Well, they get bound by these different transport proteins and enter into the cytosol, or the intersection of the cell. So if we were to imagine this is the exterior of the cell, this is the interior of the cell known as the cytosol, and here we've got our cell membrane that's separating out the exterior from the interior. And here we've got our phospholipid membrane. So the actual cell membrane is made up of phospholipids. So we've got these fatty acid molecules that are bound to these heads to the phospholipid molecule. Now, how do lutein and zeaxanthin enact this benefit to our eyes? Well, because of their chemical structure, they have a potent ability to quench reactive oxygen species, or free radicals, so essentially damaging molecules that our cells produce. Now, our cells are constantly assaulted by different factors, different variables that ultimately increase the number of damaging molecules. So an example of that specific in this situation is UV radiation. So ultraviolet radiation can increase the cell's production of oxidative stress molecules like reactive oxygen species and free radicals. Now, those molecules, because they are chemically unsatisfied, they start to rip away at and tear away at different sections of the cell. If that's different enzymatic reactions, they damage those. They can damage mitochondria, they can damage endoplasmic reticulum, they can damage the cell membrane itself, they can damage basically any section of the cell if they are overabundant. So our eyes have a lens, or a protective layer that blocks out a lot of the damaging radiation that comes from UV radiation. And among that is this incorporation of lutein and zeaxanthin. So lutein and zeaxanthin aren't just freely floating in the cytosol inside the cell, but they're also integrated into the cell membrane. And because, like I mentioned, their chemical structure is a certain way, it allows them to interact with these reactive oxygen species and essentially neutralize them, which is a huge benefit. Now, in addition to that, they can also recruit, once they're embedded into the cell membrane, they recruit these membrane-associated binding proteins that also have an antioxidant ability, in that they can also quench a lot of these damaging molecules. So that's a brief background on the mechanisms by which lutein and zeaxanthin have these positive effects. But what I was especially interested in is to look at this. And this particular study popped up because I was interested in figuring out, well, what are the best sources of lutein and zeaxanthin? So if you wanted to improve your eye health. And a lot of people reference to eggs because they have lutein and zeaxanthin. That said, however, they actually have very, very small amounts by comparison to other sources, specifically plant-based sources. So from kale to spinach to zucchini to squash, there's all kinds of different plant-based foods that have much, much higher. I'm talking on the order of 10, 20, 30 times more lutein and zeaxanthin than eggs. However, if a person did want to consume eggs instead of plant-based, I was curious if that would actually make a meaningful difference. So this study looked at that. They recruited participants that were in their 70s and 80s, so 26 women, 7 men, and then had them consume 1 egg per day, so merely 1 egg per day, for 5 weeks. Then they went through a washout period where they stopped consuming that egg and essentially returned back to their normal nutrition. And then they were on another 5 weeks without specifically cutting out eggs. And then they compared the pre versus post, so the baseline versus after the 5 weeks on consuming 1 egg a day, and the pre versus post, or baseline versus post, of not consuming any eggs. And they compared those two those two values. Now, their nutrition was largely the same across the board. So when they were off of eggs or when they were consuming that 1 egg a day, you can see here that the overall changes were, well, there were no changes except for the one variable that did change was dietary cholesterol, which is to be expected. If you start consuming eggs, those have dietary cholesterol in them. So that's going to increase your dietary cholesterol. So that was important to look at as well, that there weren't any substantial differences in like caloric intake or dietary fiber or protein or whatever it might be, other variables that might affect the results that we see here. So looking at that data, we can see here that's with the serum lutein. So looking at serum lutein, looking at serum zeaxanthin, we can see that there's an increase in both. So both have increased blood levels of each of these carotenoids. So that would indicate then that egg consumption does lead to improvements or increases in these carotenoids. Now, one more thing that might be of interest to people is looking at the cardiovascular disease risk factors. So with egg consumption, especially if you're consuming saturated fats, if you're consuming dietary cholesterol, there's more complexity to that. Typically, we don't really associate dietary cholesterol except in very specific instances to increase your blood cholesterol levels, your blood lipoprotein levels. And here we look at these different lipoproteins. So we've got total cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, HDL cholesterol, and triglycerides. And we can see that after 5 weeks of consuming 1 egg per day, there was no change in any of these variables. If you compare the white bars, which is the no egg, so same individuals, keep in mind, this isn't a separate group. This is the same individuals, same genetic background, same nutrition, all that, versus the black bars, which is the single egg consumption. Now, might that change if they start consuming 3 or 4 eggs per day? That's a possibility. But as it stands, what we do know is that a single egg is sufficient to increase zeaxanthin and lutein levels in the blood. Now, what we can't do, however, is necessarily then jump to the conclusion that if you consume 1 egg, then and you see this increase in blood levels, that then translates to what's found in the eye. And my speculation is that if you were to consume plant-based sources, although they are not as bioavailable, meaning that they're not as readily absorbed as egg sources of lutein and zeaxanthin, then if you were to just base it on plant-based, you'd probably still see much higher levels of absorption, simply because the concentration found in those foods is much higher, even if the absorption is lower. So something to keep in mind, you can go either way. This study doesn't fully prove by any means that it has a direct effect on the eyes. However, there are some associative studies that have been done over 10, 15 years where macular degeneration, or the degeneration of our eyes, is actually related to our egg consumption, as in, to be clear, that with greater egg consumption, there is a reduced macular degeneration. So there is something to it, and it seems like a decent evidence that egg consumption can provide some level of protection for the eyes, even if I still think that plant-based is probably superior. But does it really matter in the end? Probably not, at least on these metrics. So hopefully you got some use out of this, and there you go. Till next time.